Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of ITSS Verona Member Series podcast. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Leonardo, and I'm part of the Africa team. With me today, there are also my colleagues, Camila and Angelo. Today, we are delighted to welcome two distinguished guests, Mr. André Kahlmeyer and Mr. Kristian Svendsen from Conflict Management Consulting, an independent consultancy group founded in 2014 and based in Brussels, specializing in advisory service, monitoring and evaluation, and conflict analysis in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. CMC works with international organizations, including the European Union, the United Nations, and major bilateral donors and NGOs supporting evidence-based decision-making in complex humanitarian and security environments. Mr. André Kahlmeyer is the founder and CEO of Conflict Management Consulting and an international expert in evaluation, governance, and humanitarian programming, with over 20 years of experience working in fragile and conflict-affected contexts across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. He has led complex evaluation, research, and advisory assignments with particular expertise in conflict analysis, rule of law, and governance reform, and has held senior roles with institutions such as the European External Action Service, GIZ, and the Parliamentary Assembly of NATO. He also brings direct first-hand experience from Sudan, having worked extensively in Darfur and Khartoum prior to the current conflict, and having been recently deployed to Port Sudan. Mr. Kristian Svendsen is lead on PeaceTech and Senior Researcher at Conflict Management Consulting, where he leads tech-enabled monitoring and analysis for hard-to-reach crises, with a special focus on the Horn of Africa and Sudan, where he lived and worked from 2019 to 2021. He is also a council member at RIKO, a Danish foreign policy think tank on international conflict resolution. Mr. Kahlmeyer and Mr. Svendsen, thank you very much for being here with us today. It's a pleasure to have you here with us for our podcast. Our discussion today will focus on the current and often under-investigated conflict in Sudan, with particular attention to European policy perspectives, international responses, and all that deals with the access to the information field. So let us begin with the first question. Compared to other current and past conflicts around the world, the one in Sudan has had very little attention in Western media and discourses. So what is the state of political mobilization at the level of the EU and UN? In other words, what are the strategies, action, diplomatic, and peace-building missions put in place at the international level to face the current state of affairs in Sudan, both in terms of violence prevention and humanitarian distress?
All right, thanks. Yeah, thanks for having us. Maybe I'll just try and start on that question. Also, before, maybe I just want to mention, like we were talking about, Sudan is one of the biggest and largest humanitarian and displacement crises in the world right now. It is the largest humanitarian crisis, and almost 2/3 of the population is in some need of assistance. And more than 12 million people, they have been forced to leave their home by now. So it's a big crisis, and I think we need to also keep that in mind when discussing something like this. I also wanted to stress that what is keeping many communities running or alive in Sudan is their self-organization. International organizations have largely lost their capability to respond in some ways, both because of aid cuts and so on. We'll come more into that. But it's self-organization in Sudan, neighborhood communities, emergency response rooms, you might have heard of them, women-led groups, all of these, they are stepping in, where the formal systems, they have failed now. And adding to that, like, me and Andre's knowledge is of course from having traveled there and worked there and read about it. But what keeps us informed now is Sudanese people on the ground. It's our networks and friends that is suffering from this crisis and are trying their best to turn it around. So, like, we work closely with Sudanese colleagues and partners, and most of what we will share today, that's grounded in their perspectives and their analysis and whatever they know from the field. And yeah, I just wanted to mention that initially, just to recognizing that, like, there's limits of what our external perspectives can answer now. So keeping that in mind, let me try and go to your first question. So the EU and the UN political mobilization on Sudan today, right? That's what you were asking about. So essentially, just to some background, maybe like it's a war between two militaries, right? Fighting for control of the state. That's what it's very simply said. Like you have the SAF, the Sudanese Armed Forces, and you have the RSF, right? The Rapid Support Forces. And that the latter one has also evolved into what was a militia, but it's more of a military organization now, right? A full military organization. And between these, you have the 33 million civilians that are left and need humanitarian assistance. Well, 33 million that need humanitarian assistance. It's about, what is there, 40 something million in Sudan. So it's 2/3, right, of the population that is in need of help right now. And that's why, as I mentioned, it's the largest humanitarian emergency in the world right now. And on what has failed, like what is it that has been done already? Like the international community has tried, right, to stop repeatedly, right, of course, this war. You have had like what we call the Jeddah platform. It was Saudi Arabia and the US that launched this quite early in May 2023, just a month after the war, the conflict broke out. We should call it a war, I guess now. And both parties actually signed a ceasefire at that moment. And again in October 23, they tried again, but at both instances, the completely broke. Like both parties violated every of the commitment that they have. And yeah, then it's basically it's just stopped. Then you have actors like IGAD, the African Union, right, meditating. But none of this has stuck. And now you have the Quad countries, which is also US, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and some of these that are trying to do it. But again, it comes out to nothing. And it's probably not that it's bad diplomacy, but it's because neither of the warring sides right now, and for that matter, the regional actors that are involved in this has an interest in making it stop. So like there is this this is kind of the thing, right? There's the core of why this conflict is so difficult. Like there's neither SAF or RSF, the warring parties, they have any incentive to negotiate. They don't have they don't believe, well, they both believe that they can win, right, with military means, and that's, I guess, the fundamental problem of this. So if you look at the regional actors, so SAF has support from Iran, Egypt, from Russia, and on the other side, RSF, they have like some covert support from the Arab Emirates, the United Arab Emirates, channeled through Libya, who gives them some support routes. And with this external backing flowing, like there's none of the actors really have any existential threat to their military pressure. So they can just sustain warfare indefinitely at the moment. I could continue on that, but again, if we should talk about like when in conflict theory, right, you have this idea about ripeness. So it's the idea that conflict becomes resolvable when both parties perceive that the continued warfare is costlier than negotiation. And at the moment, like it's spectacularly unripe by that measure, and has been since the war break. So it's cheaper almost, right, for both sides to continue war than peace right now. So yeah, you have this external financing that's sustained this fighting on both sides, and war profits they fund these two institutions. So yeah, you have a situation there, right, where declarations get signed, commitments are made, and then they are immediately violated because there's no cost to the violation really. So yeah, it's a standing on that.
Right.
Yeah, Andrew, would you
Yeah,
jump in?
maybe I can add. Thanks also from me for inviting us. It's nice to be here. Yeah, I mean the question about the European Union, the United Nations, two of the major actors we are also working for in different projects. So both, I mean, UN has a number of different organizations. As we all know, the European Union has different funding instruments. But what we're seeing is that both, I think, both the EU and the UN are most active on humanitarian response in Sudan. And that's important, but of course, in order to solve a conflict, ultimately you need different instruments, a whole toolbox of different instruments, from diplomacy to mediation, conflict management, and so what we see is the UN being most active on the humanitarian response. The EU clearly is one of the largest, if not the largest, humanitarian donor. For example, the OCHA, the United Nations OCHA, Sudan Humanitarian Fund, the EU is the largest donor to it, and funding NGOs, international humanitarian actors active in Sudan, and that is an important contribution. But at the same time, if you look at the needs assessment, the humanitarian needs assessment for Sudan, only a small fraction of what is actually needed is covered by, and it's not only the EU's responsibility, of course, to cover these needs, but the funding for humanitarian action is limited compared to the huge needs in Sudan. Now, the UN, again, I mean, UN has many different agencies, but what we see is UN's role is mainly in coordination, in negotiating access for humanitarian action, some diplomacy, but the coercive tools, the ability to really mediate in this conflict is limited. So what we see, looking especially at the EU, the UN, is a high focus on humanitarian mobilization, but low political leverage to mediate in this conflict. So there is a response. I think everyone working on Sudan would wish the humanitarian response would be larger than it currently is. But these are the realities, also given overall budget cuts. So US aid used to be a major player. The US government used to be a major player in humanitarian action. There's still some humanitarian action, but not through US aid and not to the degree anymore as before. And but then there's also budget cuts for humanitarian funding in most other Western governments that used to be traditional donors of humanitarian and development funding. So we're seeing a response in Sudan, but most people would agree that in order to meet the size of the problem, the crisis in Sudan, the response would have to be much larger than it currently is.
Okay, thanks for the first questions, and also hello and welcome from my side, Mr. Kahlmeyer and Svendsen. For the second question, we would like to focus more from the European perspective. Therefore, the second question is, from a European policy perspective, what explains the comparatively low level of political engagement with Sudan since the outbreak of the war compared to the mobilization in Europe for Ukraine and Gaza? Is it a conscious deprioritization?
Yes, thank you. That's an important question. It's also a question that Sudanese often discuss, right? So comparing the international response, not only the European, but the international response to the crisis in Sudan and the conflict in Sudan compared to other crises on this planet. I mean, one problem, of course, is limited funding, shrinking budgets, as we just mentioned for the first question. Another is the number of crises, basically, that actors have to deal with. So we just had a look earlier at the one of the globally used indicators for number of crises. So the Heidelberg conflict barometer is something we just quickly looked at, and I looked at the latest figures. So for 2024, it identified a total of 365 conflicts globally, and 27 active wars. So you have basically globally, you have a number of wars and crises, and some of them are not necessarily forgotten, but are totally underfunded. And Sudan now, I guess, is one of those. Now, the reasons for funding or not funding or heavily funding a humanitarian crisis is partly linked to media reports, to global attention in media. Sometimes the Sudan conflict is kind of framed by media reports as a distant, complicated, complex conflict, chronic conflict. So if you label a conflict as chronic, then it ultimately also leads to this feeling that it's less urgent, it needs less attention. So there's something about how this conflict is portrayed in media, and there's clearly competition is not the right word, but apparently there's only a limited number of conflicts that really like high level political discussions can focus on in meetings in the media, and there's other crises, other conflicts, Ukraine, Gaza especially, that for a number of reasons. So Ukraine is I guess in Europe often seen as a more like direct threat to European security. Gaza, the Middle East conflict has a very long history of European attention to it. So and that so basically limited budgets, limited attention, media reporting, and having to deal globally with a large number of humanitarian crises and conflicts leads to a situation where at the moment Sudan is clearly not prioritized, and that's unfortunate in many ways, but most likely every population affected by a conflict would hope for international attention in terms of funding, but it's currently just not there in Sudan the way it used to be in the past before other more visible conflicts and crises appeared, like Ukraine and Gaza, for example.
Yeah, and it's misleading, right? So as I mentioned in the beginning, it's the largest humanitarian emergency with like more than 30 million people and 2/3 of the country that require assistance, right? So it's really misleading also that this is the way it's been framed. Like there is like it's a state collapse, right? What we see in real time, and the consequences they can cascade also like into regional destabilization. And I think for Europe, it's an issue maybe that it's not treating it as like they treat it as an analytical separate thing, right? Then from its strategic interest, but there is different things that is very strategic interest, security interest for Europe also. Like it's first of all something that has become more and more important for European strategic interest is displacement and refugee pressure, right? So there's like I said around 10 million that are internally displaced now, remaining in Sudan. That was the latest numbers in January 2026. And several other millions that has fled across borders, right, to Egypt, Chad, South Sudan, Uganda, Libya, and so on. And like this, of course, there's different issues with that. It exacerbates like ethnic tensions, and straining on already fragile economies and so on, right? And I think like this potentially triggering domestic political crisis. That EU also should consider strategically vital for Suez security and Mediterranean stability, and so on, right? So it has, of course, interest for EU also, and also second, something that we are seeing also with Yemen now, right? The Red Sea control and geopolitical competition here, like there is also a big interest for global trade in keeping security. And we have seen how much money we're now spending on the I don't remember what it's called, the mission in the Red Sea to secure that Yemenite war is not spreading into attacking maritime vessels in the Red Sea, and it's the same thing, right? For Sudan, this can be a problem in the future if you start looking at the bigger perspectives of these things. And then of course you have like a third problem is like weapons proliferation and terror network entrenchment and these things that we have seen earlier also in Sudan when if you get a system that supports things like this or are unable to control what is happening in their own state, like you have of course also security issues with that. Yeah.
Talking about the bigger picture, the third question is focusing on a peaceful solution in Sudan. Therefore, the question is, which international actors have a realistic influence for a peaceful resolution in Sudan? Which constraints are those international actors probably facing in the peace process? And is the EU still important in the context of finding a peaceful resolution?
Yeah, I think like Sudan's conflict is somewhat different from typical mediation environments because like peace depends. It's not only on diplomatic skill, but it's also whether like the belligerents, like the warring parties, they face any cost for refusing to negotiate, right? And right now, as I mentioned in the beginning, there's not really like that's the core problem. I mean, they don't right now, right? And also, I think I noted into that, but it's the regional actors, right? The regional actors that control most of the levers right now. And unfortunately, they have divergent interest, right? So you have Egypt, they hold a very high leverage. They control the Suez Canal, airspace. Egyptian airspace is critical for some of the weapon smuggling that has been going on. And they have, of course, the big direct border with Sudan also, and faces direct consequences if Sudan collapses further. Like refugee flows, the Nile water security is threatened, and so on. And also, actually, recently Egypt has shown this leverage also. Here in January, they conducted airstrikes targeting RSF supplies, so they have engaged a bit more maybe recently, and it was both like, of course, military action, but it's also symbolic diplomacy enforcing some of these things. And they have started to deny airspace also to UAE cargo flights that they are suspecting to carry weapons to RSF. So they are deploying leverage in that sense. Then you have Saudi Arabia, who is also very important in the Sudan discussion. Especially diplomatic weight and financial capacity. And they have actually recently aligned more with Egypt now, declaring their Sudan position more or less identical to what Egypt is thinking. So this is quite a strategic realignment and something that we will see the outcome of in the near future, I think. But it's kind of signals a more regional consensus that it's forming, which was very difficult before, and it might still not end up in any consensus, but it looks like there is a little bit of leverage. Yeah. Then you have on the other side the Arab Emirates, right? It's moderate leverage, but they have like continued this covered supply to RSF. There's different proof on that. Like they provide drones, munitions, logistical support, and so on. It's both UN panels and other investigative outlets has documented this. But it hasn't become too costly for them yet to do this. Like they have, like for example, Somalia has denied them that to overfly Somalia now. Yeah, and then Saudi Arabia and Egypt, they are now aligned against Emirati leverage, right? So they are facing some kind of like reputational isolation now, it seems, but they still continue, it looks like, to supply RSF covertly. So they are still somehow calculating that this is the better geopolitical position, right? At the moment. Then things like Chad, South Sudan, Ethiopia, they have limited leverage, really. Like they have some border checkpoints, right? Airfields, but they are economically weak and not the biggest leverage. And then like the problem, as I mentioned in the beginning, like it's still that this war economy is really profitable for the perpetrators in it. So the moment there is a lot of benefits for continuing the war, there's control of various economies. There's been some documentation on the, what is it called, the gum, Arab gum sector, right? That is like being used in medical industry and food products and so on. It's Sudan is, I think it's 80 or 90% of the production of this, so it's an important provider of these things. But this has continued and it's controlled by the warring parties. On the other side, the oil revenue, there's the gold revenue, these things. So there's really a large control from the warring parties, economic control that kind of leads them also to continue, right, through this kind of military industrial complex. And like negotiated settlements right now, it's a revenue loss, right, for both sides. So it means, yeah, loss of the economic rents. So right now it's still like economically rational for both perpetrators. There's not really any cost imposition, sanctions, supply line interdiction, like these things. It's not enough weight on them yet. So this is keeping any of the like proposed solutions and negotiations to really succeed. I think is one of the reasons. Then there is like last point maybe from my side is like we have the problem of SAF being dependent on the old kind of Islamic structures in Sudan also, which makes it very difficult for them somehow to negotiate also on, let's say, civilian-led steps, right? So it's really like it becomes non-negotiable to have a military victory, right? It's not so much ideology; it's institutional survival for these actors also. Yeah, and a civilian oversight from both parties, like that would mean that they need to be accountable for atrocities that we have seen and loss of the military economy, which was a big thing now and was before the war also. Yeah,
Yes.
something to add, André?
Yeah, maybe I can add to be because you also asked about the role of the European Union. The European Union is a major stakeholder. It is relevant in Sudan. We mentioned it. The largest funder of humanitarian action, for example, in Sudan, but it is not in this, to our knowledge, in this conflict. It's not like a classic mediator, so a external third party that is convening the conflict parties and trying to negotiate settlement. So the EU is not doing this. The power of, at the moment, the power of the EU is its economic power, regulatory power. The EU is the major actor in enforcing sanctions against Sudan, financial oversight, trade controls. There's many also, I mean, in addition to this war situation and the war economy Kristian mentioned, there's many other related problems around this: human trafficking, illegal migration, money laundering, terror financing. So Sudan is exposed to many conflict drivers. The EU clearly has a role in as a regulatory power, sanctions, financial oversight, trade controls. The EU can also, with its different instruments, in addition to the humanitarian instruments, of course, the EU has many options at hand to work on a conflict or work in a conflict situation, to support potentially civilian alternatives, local mediation projects, and also a planning for the future of Sudan after this conflict is hopefully at some point coming to an end. Right? So like a future governance planning, a post-conflict situation. The EU can have a big role in reconciliation at some point. But of course, at the moment, this is still very much in the future and very much unclear when it is important. So the EU is in this conflict not not the key mediation actor that can ultimately end the conflict. This is more the regional actors, I think, in our understanding that Kristian mentioned. The US, of course, always is globally a dominant and relevant actor to end conflicts, but the role of the U.S. government has also changed in the past year quite dramatically with the end of U.S. aid, which was a major player in Sudan. We evaluated U.S. aid projects in Sudan in the past, so this was an important contribution also to peace building in Sudan that is lacking. But of course, there's still the diplomatic power the U.S. potentially has. But at the moment, we see mainly regional actors that Kristian mentioned as being those that might be the most relevant when thinking about peace in Sudan.
Our next question is directly related to your work as a consultant and researcher at CMC Consulting. In Germany, we have the saying, the first thing that dies in a war is the truth. So how do you gather reliable sources and informations when the field looks so inaccessible? How do you conduct daily monitoring on the Sudanese situation? And how can a researcher study the current situation in Sudan properly?
Yeah, thanks. So this is definitely up our scale of work, right? So we work in Sudan, as you said, it looks inaccessible, and basically it is inaccessible in many ways. But we, as a company that work in hard to reach areas and conflict affected settings, right? We have learned and we have practice of working within those constraints. So the key is really accepting that you can't have a perfect information in that sense, but you need to design systems that can give you some kind of information, right? That's good enough to act on at least, and is triangulated. That's like a keyword, right? You can't just have from single source, but you need to triangulate as best as you can. So we never rely really on one channel, and there is things that you can still do, even though that me and Andre and research from the outside might be very limited what areas you can travel to do research. Instead, you need to rely on what is possible, right? So there is some things, of course, it's possible in many places. You have incident databases like the ACLED, the Armed Conflict Location Event Data. They provide real-time incident reporting about Sudan, other areas also, but also about Sudan. And they aggregate media, NGO alerts, social media, and have also networks on the ground. And of course, we use this a lot to give us a situational awareness about what's happening on the ground. Then we use remote sensing data, which is becoming increasingly interesting to use also. So that's anything from satellite images. You can also, if you have the financing and the budget for it, like buy very, very high resolution satellite images and can be used to verify, right? Whatever you have heard, if you have burned structures or vehicle concentration or new displacement areas or things like this, that's possible also. It's not always necessary, depending on what your scope is. Then, of course, you have organizations like the IOM, International Organization for Migration. They also provide displacement data that you can rely on. And then maybe more importantly, and what our main contribution here is that the local networks, right, of people on the ground. So we work with local networks of CSOs and enumerators. We have direct access to most areas in Sudan and can figure out to get access also to other places. And they have the best, really the ground truth, right? They are of course, in a sense, vulnerable to retaliation if identified. We have to be very conflict sensitive in these points. But they know what's going on the ground. They know the context. They are, in many ways, the best sources for understanding what is going on the ground. And then, of course, you have diaspora networks. You have media that when it exists, when it works, it's possible. At the moment, like, of course, it's also you have internet shutdowns and these things, but you still find ways of getting contact with Sudanese. It can travel on different, like in the worst case scenarios, it's radio signals that you can use to communicate. But at the moment in our world today, there's always internet access available somewhere. So you have stations now in Sudan with Starlink networks, right? So you can go to these positions, and our enumerators use that. There's again like a need for being careful because a lot of these Starlinks boxes, or what you would call them, they are of course monitored also by RSF or SAF affiliates sometimes. So there's a lot of precautions that need to take, but this is the way really to get information from the ground, and the way that we do our everyday work also, doing third-party monitoring and situational awareness in Sudan.
Yes, and maybe I can add. So, I mean, Kristian mentioned it. I think it's one. I mean, it's a legitimate concern. How can one get reliable information about the situation in Sudan? Reliable information that you would need for external engagement. How can you produce baseline data? How can you monitor projects? How can you help? And there's investment in Sudan, and there's external engagement, development cooperation with Sudan, humanitarian development, peace building. So money is going into Sudan for projects, and it's a legitimate question to know what is the effect of this, how to prevent abuse or money disappearing in the wrong channels, wrong pockets. These are all legitimate questions. I mean, our response, I guess, is working with trusted long-term partners. Kristian mentioned it. So we have been, Kristian, as you mentioned in your introduction, Kristian has been based earlier in Sudan. I have done quite a number of assignments in Darfur, in Khartoum, in Blue Nile State, in different parts of Sudan. All of this before the current conflict, but we have ongoing projects now in Sudan. We have a small office in Port Sudan. I was there a few weeks ago. So trusted long-term partners, and investing time in building the capacity also of partners where it's needed, spending time together in Port Sudan or in Nairobi sometimes. So I think that's part of the response. And then, of course, for the data collection itself, for the research, we're doing different types of surveys, third-party monitoring, evaluations, baseline studies, research on topics like the role of different stakeholders and actors in Sudan in the current situation. It follows like, I mean, an important aspect in these assignments is to look at a very good methodology, how to get reliable information, ethical principles for field research. So explaining to people why any kind of research data collection is being done, how the data is being used, and showing that data is protected, anonymized, not to expose any of those that conduct interviews to any kind of harm. So we apply to all of our work, we apply these do no harm and other ethical principles. But ultimately, I mean, we try to reduce the risk of being manipulated, being fed the wrong type of information or biased information. We try to reduce this as much as possible, but it's never, as Kristian also kind of mentioned, it's never 100%. So what we're trying to do is to work with confidence level to help organizations to make informed decisions, but keeping in mind that there will always be a certain degree of uncertainty. And there have been many contexts, also conflict contexts, where it was ultimately very difficult to obtain high level, high quality, reliable data. But we try as much as possible. And I mean, we work in quite a number of conflict contexts, active conflict zones. So we've developed and others have developed a number of tools how to collect data in restricted or like access denied environments. At the same time, yeah, there will always be a limitation, but we try to be as transparent as possible about like the confidence we have in the information that we are able to collect.
To wrap up our interview, I would like to go back to what you previously discussed about the way that the war in Sudan is framed in public and policy debates. In public debates, Sudan is often discussed as primarily as a humanitarian emergency in terms of aid, displacement, and civilian suffering. While this framing rightly adopts a human security perspective, it can exclude crucial aspects such as a deeper understanding of the war, political accountability, thus shaping perceptions and priorities. From your perspective, how has this humanitarian framing shaped Europe's understanding of the war in Sudan, and what other aspects are we underlooking because of it?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I'll start and then Kristian can add to it. So Sudan really needs many things at the moment, but there's really two major things of external support that Sudan needs. Clearly the humanitarian lens is important. So there's a need for a humanitarian response. People are suffering, people are starving, people are exposed to violence. So there's clearly a huge need for humanitarian support. At the same time, there's a need for a medium-term solution to that conflict and crisis, and that is much more of a political and diplomatic approach that is needed, and it needs both. But the humanitarian support, the humanitarian principles, humanitarian support is expected to be neutral and is not really a tool in any way that can be used or will ever be used in order to solve conflicts like the high-level political conflict in Sudan. So what it needs in our view, of course, it needs both. It needs immediate humanitarian support, helping to alleviate some of the suffering. And as we mentioned at the beginning, it's not covering the needs at the moment. It's underfunded. International humanitarian response is severely underfunded. The UN, NGOs, other actors working on humanitarian issues are severely limited in what they can do because of lack of funding or low funding. But at the same time, also it needs a political solution to this crisis, and that's where limitations come in. As we discussed earlier, who are the actors that could actually help to solve this crisis, and that is kind of limited. And those that are the largest humanitarian funders, like the EU, are not necessarily those actors that can actually solve it. So the problem with a protracted humanitarian crisis is that this is, in a way, it's you can fund this for a very long time, but the ultimate solution would be to end the conflict as much as possible at the same time, and then that would also reduce the need for humanitarian support. So it needs both at the same time. Unfortunately, it's not at the moment not necessarily the same actors that could provide both responses that are needed in Sudan.
Yeah, I was just thinking like this, the humanitarian frame, like it kind of obscures some things, right? That actors like Europe or EU should maybe somehow understand or talk about more. Like it's as what we mentioned, like the war economy, first of all, right? That these actors in the war, that it's keeping it going, they are keeping it going because they have an economic benefit from it, right? They basically, officers, they extract personal wealth also. It's not a side effect of the war, right? This is what the reason for the war, really, right? And this is what made this humanitarian narrative misses, right? It's not just about personal enrichment. It's also this institutional control that they are afraid of losing. The SAF and, for that sake, RSF actors, they both have a lot of control over economic institutional control across Sudan. So this is one thing, right? and this is why it's non-negotiable for them to find a settlement that includes like a civilian oversight, for example, like that will give them accountability for their atrocities and loss of this military autonomy and the control of the economy, basically, right? And I think second, this humanitarian, like this is a different area of it. Like this humanitarian frame is also treats the Sudanese as victims, right? And as I mentioned in the beginning, like we wouldn't be able to do any of our work if it wasn't for our Sudanese colleagues. And it's the same thing in the like as political actors, like they are also able to solve their own conflicts, and we have seen it on and on in Sudan that these like emergency response committees, they have secured deals for informal truces in different places, like El Fasher initially at Duane, there was like elders that made a 7-month non-aggression pact and different things. So they have these conflict prevention wins. They are not just like humanitarian services in that sense. So local actors, like this localization problem is something that we discuss a lot in humanitarian funding, right? Like we want to send the money in a sense directly to locals, and as there is a policy to increase the amount, but still it's like a minimal amount of the donor money that goes directly to people on the ground, to the locals. And it's a huge gap, and I think we need to, like donors and organizations, they need to recognize that in the current state of humanitarian system, we need to be much more close to the local groups. They have the legitimacy, the efficiency, the sustainability advantages, and so on, to do these things also. And there's several reasons why this is not functioning right now. I think I shouldn't get into that. And because I want to mention one more thing also, like what is missing this humanitarian frame from especially European media also is just it's keeps it focused on today's crisis, right? It doesn't ask these hard questions of the policy right now. So like what kind of Sudan is being rebuilt or should be rebuilt? Who should govern it? Like Europe, they understand this like trajectory that it's into, but it's not being asked the right questions maybe. So it adds up to like, yeah, we give like Europe is the biggest humanitarian, they give the biggest humanitarian aid, right? They're the biggest donor in Sudan, but with minimal political conditions. And I don't know, but we need to ask the questions probably about should humanitarian spending be reframed for conflict prevention rather than crisis response? Is that some logic in that shift? Like there's some big questions about this, right? Like we need to understand who profits from this war and how do we choke that revenue off, like what does a post-war Sudan look like? It's not included in humanitarian aid discussions or very often. How do we link that humanitarian assistance to political conditions maybe that could push or move towards civilian governance? Can we fund civilian governance planning as EU, so that there is alternatives to what we see is maybe forming with the more military-led rule that looks like. So it's uncomfortable questions maybe, right? And that's why we often just see the discussion from our European point of view as this humanitarian frame. It's easier to discuss it like that, and it requires some kind of political will. And right now, of course, Europe is discussing very much other things related to US relations and hard power, right? We're building up our military, but we have a big history in soft power also, and some of these questions are related to soft power and how Europe wants to use this also. Yeah.
Well, thank you. That brings us to the end of today's conversation. Mr. Kahlmeyer and Mr. Svendsen, thank you very much for sharing your insights and expertise with us today. Your perspectives have been extremely valuable in shedding light on the political, humanitarian, and analytical dimensions of the war in Sudan, as well as on the role of Europe and the international community in this complex conflict. To our viewers, thank you for joining us for this edition of ITSS Verona's Member Series podcast. We hope this discussion has contributed to a deeper understanding of a conflict that deserves far greater attention. Stay tuned for our upcoming episodes, and thank you for listening.